President Lee Jae Myung is joining his global counterparts at the United Nations General Assembly this week to address the complex challenges facing the world. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective for September 23rd, that is, here in South Korea. I'm Min Sunhee. President Lee Jae Myung is scheduled to deliver his keynote speech at the United Nations General Assembly in New York on Tuesday, local time. For more on this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA here in the studio. Fabian, welcome back.
Nice to be here.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia with us. Steven, welcome back.
Always a pleasure.
Right, Fabian, before his departure for New York, President Lee Jae Myung shared his thoughts about North Korea's nuclear weapons program with the BBC. Let's start with that particular interview and its implications.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting interview. There were two main messages. So Lee Jae Myung said that he would potentially support a Trump-Kim summit and that he would also support the summit if the goal of negotiations between North Korea and the US are not a complete denuclearization of North Korea, but more a nuclear freeze, if that would be the goal. That is quite interesting. Why? Because usually the US government stance would be that North Korea has to denuclearize completely. A nuclear freeze would be a different approach. It would be more like step by step. For example, let's achieve something realistic for now and then look into the future later. So what Lee Jae Myung said is the question is whether we persist with fruitless attempts towards the ultimate goal of denuclearization, or we set more realistic goals and achieve some of them. That makes sense, and I think let's see how it will go. But Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, he recently mentioned that he does not want to be on a table with Lee Jae Myung himself. So I think what Lee Jae Myung is saying is more like giving advice from the sidelines.
Right. So while North Korea's Kim Jong-un has said he does not want to be on the same table with President Lee Jae Myung, he has shared his openness to be at the table with US President Donald Trump. He's also reiterated his commitment to nuclear weapons in North Korea. Could you cover his most recent remarks for us?
So what Kim said was that he has positive memories of meeting with Trump, and I guess like the implication of that is by like invoking this as a positive memory, like it's meant to signal that he'd be willing to have some kind of meeting like that again, but he would want to carry forward on the condition that the U.S. drop its demand for North Korea's unconditional denuclearization. This has been a long-standing thing for North Korea. They've long wanted recognition as a nuclear state and like wanted to be recognized as having these weapons and this being like a legitimate expression of their statehood, and it's a right that they see other countries exercising and they feel like they should have the same kind of wherewithal. I wonder if maybe Kim sees this as feasible with Trump, because Trump has shown himself to be an unconventional leader in a lot of ways, just the way that he carried out summits with Kim during his first term. And just in that, like, Trump doesn't have a lot of time for the diplomatic technicalities and niceties that we normally see from world leaders. Like, Trump is not all that interested in the protocol whereby countries generally refrain from referring to North Korea as a nuclear armed state, because that implies recognition, and that's like something that world leaders are coached on how they should be careful to speak in this way in public. Trump, I think, just as a more realist, kind of transactional, call it like you see it kind of guy, he just looks at North Korea and he says like, well, they have nuclear weapons, so like why is there this like unspoken protocol in place where we can't refer to them in that way? So maybe Kim is floating this because he sees this as an opportunity for winning this recognition that he's wanted for so long. Maybe if he thinks that he can kind of lay the breadcrumbs that lead to a meeting with Trump where they have an understanding that the U.S. will be negotiating from a very different standpoint than they have in the past, that maybe this is an opportunity for him. Time will tell. I mean, Trump has said, kind of similar positive allusions to the prospect of potentially meeting with Kim, but nobody has put forth any concrete proposals or suggestions or implications about the timing or how this would all go ahead. So Kim has, I guess, kind of put the ball in Trump's court to some extent with these comments.
Right. And that being said, Fabian, do you suppose that South Korea perhaps could be taken out of the equation of seeking to ease tensions, nuclear tensions, that is, on the Korean Peninsula? I mean, how does South Korea retain its relevance, especially keeping in mind North Korea's intent, well, it appears intent on engaging directly with the US while sharing very open disdain for South Korea?
Yeah, so North Korea's attempt is to get South Korea out and not involved. But of course, what South Korean President Lee Jae Myung can do is he can, first of all, try to consult with Trump as closely as he can, and also try to, maybe pull the strings from the background a little bit. But in the end, I think Donald Trump will do what he wants to do and will not listen to any other country so much. I mean, we've seen that in several occasions before. And I think also from the South Korean perspective, I would not get the hopes too high for any future Kim-Trump summit. I mean, I've read the speech from Kim Jong-un that he gave over the weekend. It was very hostile towards South Korea, and that is quite remarkable because Lee Jae Myung, he has shown that he's willing to give some concessions, that he wants to restart inter-Korean relations, that he wants to rebuild trust. North Korea does not seem interested in that and does not seem interested in an exchange between the two Koreas. And what he is interested in, Kim Jong-un, is that he sees an opportunity to play Trump, to get some advantage from him, and that's why he's kind of showing some willingness to meet with him directly. I mean, maybe it can even work, but I think from the South Korean perspective, the developments are not so positive. I think they are rather concerning.
Right, and of course, North Korea has demanded that Trump surrender the nuclear abandons demand in order for the two to meet. Steven, here's a bit of a tough question, if you will. The UN marks its 80th anniversary this week, and how effective do you suppose has this multilateral platform been in perhaps easing nuclear tensions here on the Korean Peninsula?
That's an interesting question. I think to answer it, I would have to kind of address the tensions, which are a lot about the perceived risk and then the actual risk itself. So I would say when it comes to the perceived risk, I would say that tensions, I think, nowadays are lower than they have been in the past. I mean, we don't hear about the risk of potential war as much as we did, say 5 or 6 years ago. It seems like North Korea doesn't affect the stock market in quite the same way that it used to. I mean, at President Lee's most recent press conference, I thought he made an interesting point where he presented the kind of progressive case for engaging peacefully with North Korea, from a market-oriented perspective. He said, we ought to. It's in our interest to draw down tensions. This is not something that we're doing to appease the North. This is something that is very in line with his approach of everything being according to the national interest. So, I mean, I guess there are people in the world who would argue that this quite strict network of United Nations sanctions has led to lower tensions because it has made it harder for North Korea to acquire the funding that it needs to develop weapons and to access the material that it needs to develop nuclear weapons. So, and we also just have to point to the fact that North Korea has not conducted a nuclear test since 2017. So perhaps that's a signal that North Korea has either been unable to acquire what it needs to push its program forward, and has maybe scaled back its ambition somewhat. But that's perceptions. And then to switch to the more tangible question of actual risk, North Korea still has an estimated roughly 50 warheads. And the United Nations has not been able to stop them from acquiring and from continuing to possess these weapons. They've given no indication that they want to get rid of them. Just as our conversation has shown so far here today, they are very steadfastly committed to keeping them. So tensions, I think, are at something of an ebb now, and I wonder if maybe 10 years down the road we might look at this present moment as a kind of transition period where North Korea went from demonstrating a willingness to move forward with its nuclear program and to develop more and more and to test, to entering a kind of stasis where they proceed as a de facto nuclear power, and they act as if they have these weapons, and these weapons are going to continue to be a key aspect of how they engage with the outside world. They are going to act like a nuclear state, and they are going to kind of wait for the world to recognize them as one. Whether or not that happens is a whole other question. But in terms of the UN's, specifically the UN's impact on it, I'd say sanctions are the biggest part of that. But as we've been discussing here today, like the more kind of day-to-day diplomatic details as to what happens with North Korea is more likely to take place on a kind of bilateral level. North Korea has made very clear, North Korea is at the UN, but they made very clear that they're not discussing their potential denuclearization. So it's nice to, it is nice to live in a world of lower tensions, and just to have like North Korea be a bit more stable, more quiet, calm part of the background of life here in Seoul. But knock on wood, let's hope it stays that way. And
fingers crossed, Steven.
Yes.
Beyond tensions here on the Korean Peninsula, Fabian, the UN General Assembly this year comes against the backdrop of raging wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, and over in Sudan. Keeping that in mind, Fabian, would you say the United Nations remains relevant?
I would say yes, but of course you can have doubts, because as you mentioned, there are many wars going on right now, and the main mission of the UN is to maintain peace. So obviously it failed its mission in many ways. And recently Gaza, for example, is an example when the US with Egypt and Qatar helped negotiate a 2-month-long truce between Hamas and Israel. The UN was not involved because of Israel's skepticism. And I think that shows that the UN often is at the sidelines, but it should be at the core. I give you some historical context. 80 years ago, the UN was founded under the impression of the Second World War, and the mission was that a tragedy like this should never repeat itself, and there should be international law that is respected by all countries, and there should not be a law of the jungle that stronger countries can invade weaker countries and can get away with it. But now this is happening again. Russia and Ukraine is a good example that Russia can just disrespect the borders and invade Ukraine. But I mean, I think that makes the UN even more relevant than ever. It is an important institution, but it needs some reform. I think many observers can agree to it. One weakness of the UN, in my opinion, is that it does not really represent the global south as much as it should be. The UN Security Council, for example, has 5 permanent members. It has China, Russia, France, UK, US, but there's no African country. Latin America, I mean, also Asia, I would say, is disproportionately underrepresented. That would be, for example, one way that could be reformed. Another way is the tools that the UN has to maintain peace, prevent peace. Maybe they should be stronger. There would be ways to improve UN, but to really doubt about the institution itself, I think that would be foolish. I think it's needed more than ever.
Right, so it is relevant, and perhaps there could be reforms with regard to the UN Security Council, which of course in itself would be quite tough.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Steven, South Korea holds the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of September. That being said, President Lee Jae Myung, he is poised to preside over a UN Security Council open debate on AI and global peace after his keynote speech at the UN General Assembly. Could you tell us a bit about the UN's AI governance efforts and their potential effects?
Well, those AI governance efforts, I think, are a really good illustration of what Fabian just laid out there, of the UN being very needed, but kind of underutilized and like not maybe having as strong of an effect as would be ideal. In the UN's own words, they say that a global approach to governing AI starts with a common understanding of its capabilities, opportunities, risks, and uncertainties. And I mention that quote because I think it just shows how hard it is to come to a kind of shared understanding of what AI might do, how much of it is something if you open any kind of news publication, one thing that you will always see, a really common theme nowadays, is like, to what extent should we see AI as being full of opportunities and full of ways that we can make the world better, and to what extent should we be worried about it and see it as something that has the potential to do great harm. And the truth, as with a lot of these big questions, is probably somewhere in the middle, that it is to some extent both of these things. So reading what some analysts have said about this AI governance architecture is that it's like a lot of things on this sort of supranational level, it's mostly symbolic, mostly like signals an intention to have a globally agreed upon set of rules for this technology and how it can be used. And that's all well and good. I think a lot of people would agree with the desirability of something like that. But AI is an extremely difficult thing to regulate. I mean, if you just think of like how AI is applied, it's like you creates these tools that almost anybody can use. So I mean, how do you? I think Bill Clinton once said something about the regulating the internet was like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. I mean, it's kind of something similar to that. And just the reality with AI being that like it is this emergent technology, it is potentially a source of great growth, it is potentially a source of incredible utility. So at the moment, the major world powers don't have a lot of incentive to want to get together to create ways in which this is regulated, because they're all competing. They're all they're putting all of their AI talent and knowledge towards developing an advantage for themselves. I mean, Lee Jae Myung has been a very vocal proponent of establishing South Korea as a AI power and, like, you know, developing tools that are specifically tailored to the Korean context and that are particularly useful to Korean users. So, I mean, it's hard not to be a little bit cynical when it comes to these, you know, big global efforts to regulate technology, just because there's an old line that, you know, technology wants to be free. I think that there's a flaw in that logic, because the technology, at least so far, AI does not have its own logic. It doesn't do what it wants. It does what people want it to do. And there's a lot of people who want AI to remain a kind of unregulated Wild West that is capable of all kinds of things, good and bad. So the UN definitely has its work cut out for it, as do all regulatory bodies when it comes to AI.
Right, for sure. Fabian, beyond the official UN agenda, President Lee Jae Myung is also expected to engage in a number of bilateral talks on the margins of the multilateral UN gathering with his European counterparts. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so far, from my knowledge, there will be talks with leaders from France, Italy, Czech Republic, and Poland. And it's fair to assume that, for example, when he meets with Polish representatives, security and defense cooperation will be at the core of the agenda, because South Korea is a very really reliable supplier of weapons, military equipment towards Poland. And Poland right now is at a very precarious situation. They feel threatened by Russia, and recent events have underlined that even more so. So they need more weapon imports. I think South Korea can deliver that. With Czech Republic, I think one of the topics is also the energy cooperation. South Korean companies, they signed a contract to build a nuclear power plant in Czech Republic. That is a big economic deal. Then, for example, with France, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, I'm sure that President Lee Jae Myung also wants to get France on board when it comes to bringing peace on the Korean Peninsula, so basically promoting that agenda. So there's a lot to talk about. Of course, we don't know all the details yet, but I think I gave you like a rough overview.
Right, and Steven, on the subject of multilateral meetings, it appears that quite a number of important bilateral gatherings are expected to take place on the sidelines of the APEC leaders meeting here in South Korea this autumn. That being said, Steven, which bilateral summits are you perhaps keeping an eye on?
Well, it kind of reminds me of like when you go to a music festival and you have to look at the schedule before, and you've got to pick the bands that you really want to see. The APEC summit looks like it's going to have, you know, the biggest possible headliners, in that both Trump and Xi Jinping have signaled that they intend to come here for it and they intend to meet. So, I mean, just for me, because like I have to filter all this through like what's relevant to my work, I will definitely be watching President Lee's meetings with both Trump and Xi, because this will be a interesting kind of demonstration of like the old Korean diplomatic premise that this country needs to balance ties with the US and with China, and you know, kind of signaling some extent of loyalty to the US, but like also, you know, not wanting to appear too decisively on the side of the US. I think President Lee, like everything that he's done in terms of foreign policy up until now, has left him with a fair bit of room to maneuver, in that like he has been very clear, like right from his inauguration, that the only kind of ideology that he's operating on is a sort of lack of ideology, that he's just being very pragmatic and he's just pursuing each individual interaction through the logic of how best he can benefit South Korea's national interests. I think that's been prudent of him, and I think that's going to, in APEC, that's going to give him a kind of a strong opening hand when he interacts with both of these leaders. So I'll be watching both of those. I think that would be Lee's first in-person meeting with Xi, if I'm not mistaken, and it wouldn't be his first meeting with Trump, but it would be an interesting and a decisive kind of follow-up to the discussions that they had when Lee visited the U.S., and it would be their first in-person interaction since the arrest of the Korean workers in the U.S. and like a number of developments that pertain to the bilateral trade relationship. So I'll definitely be watching keenly down in Gyeongju. I just hope I can get there from my hotel in time.
Right, fingers crossed for that as well. With the APEC leaders meeting in Gyeongju will take place on October 31st and November 1st. Right, that's all the time we have today. So Steven, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Fabian, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.